I am Dr. Cindy Dupuy,
And I'm Kim Sharman.
and we are back with part 2. What does a data mean? Okay, so you've now gone in and you've categorized your kids' data, and we will put the Word document up somewhere. I hope I will try and get it linked to our website, which I need to update and put a couple of attachments in, and we'll work on that. Anyhow, you've seen the little chart, word, sentence, passage, and you've seen the major classification of IQ, processing areas, and then achievement. So now what we're going to do, and I do not have all of this student's data in, but we're going to go in and look at the student's particular data and tell you what we glean out of the data in just looking at it. Okay. So if you remember over here in this column, anytime you see a number there in that final column, that means that particular student did not do as well as we would expect them to based on their estimated potential, based on their IQ score. Okay. I'm going to tell you, in just looking at this particular student, I think this student's IQ is significantly underestimated. Okay.
Why?
Because if you look at these verbal comprehension scores, so there's a verbal comprehension of a 111, putting his score in the high average range.
Wow.
And then when we come up here to the differential abilities, his verbal IQ puts him in the high average range. I think this kid is way smarter than that composite score. So when you look here in the KABC, you can see where this block in here, in a couple of different areas, he's getting particularly low scores. And when you average those together, it pulls down his full scale IQ.
So his verbal skills are much, much higher than the other skills in that
yes.
IQ. And that it shouldn't be that way.
No, it should not. There should not be. So if you remember the WISC, and we talked about discrepancies between index scores, there should not be these giant gaps between scores. Like when you look at this 112 versus an 88, that's a really big difference between scores. And so you average those together and you begin to underestimate what the student can do.
Okay? So something is wrong with the IQ test, or with how it was administered, or whether the kid had attention, or what?
I'm gonna flip what you're saying. There's not a problem with the IQ test. The problem is the IQ test doesn't demonstrate or illustrate how capable he actually is.
Okay.
And part of that may be, a significant part, I believe, is due to whether or not his stimulant medication is fully therapeutic. Now, he actually spoke to his mom about this. And based on the conversation, my immediate comment to her was, you're not on the right medication at the right dose with enough consistency. And so I've suggested she go back and get him dialed in and make sure that his dose is fully therapeutic. And you do a continuous performance task, and there are a bunch of different ones out there that measure whether or not your stimulant medication is therapeutic. Okay.
What about the other issue that if this kid has such severe dyslexia or dysgraphia, that this test is hammering on those disabilities, so it also makes his score look lower, or is that not relevant?
The underlying processes in dyslexia and dysgraphia don't necessarily directly affect your performance on an IQ test.
They don't.
So you can have particular weaknesses. So for example, on the WISC, the coding subtest is affected by dysgraphia, right? Because you're trying to copy codes. So that one particular subtest does put some weight on that, but there's no reading involved in the WISC.
Okay.
There's very limited writing involved in the WISC.
Okay.
So it's not as if the dyslexia and like he's not reading the words and then having to explain the relationships. He's not reading the vocabulary words and having to define what the words mean. It's an oral response.
So the WISC is okay.
All of the IQ tests are okay. There are some that do a better job than others in presenting how well the student is performing. So for example, the WISC places a pretty heavy emphasis on processing speed. So you have a tiny little window of time to provide responses on particular subtests. And if you're a slow processor, you could be 2 or 3 seconds over the limit and not get credit on the item, even though you gave the right answer.
So that would affect your score.
Well, if you don't get, that would affect your score, because if you don't give it in the time limit, you don't get credit, then your score goes down. So it's nuanced.
Okay.
Okay. But you begin to see that when you look here. Do you see this sequential battery here?
Yeah.
This kid had a really hard time with this. And that those two memory-based tasks are sensitive to attention. Like if you're not paying attention when I read you the series of numbers, you're not going to be able to repeat them back to me correctly, right? Okay. So let's not live in IQ land. Let's get into some of the processing areas, because this is where I begin to think that we get to the meat of the thing. Okay. So I look in verbal memory, and I'm sorry, I've got 2 of them repeated in there. My bad on that. So it's not as if the same test was given twice. That's a typo on our end. I see kind of a consistent issue going on here with verbal memory, which is part of the reason that this kid has had so many language evaluations by speech language pathologists. People's sniffer is going on saying there's something going on here. Okay. Now, verbal memory can become kind of a chicken and the egg scenario. Can you not remember because you don't understand, or do you not understand so you don't remember? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? So there's something going on language-wise, and this kid's verbal memory is affected. And we'll take a look at that when we get into his language scores. He's got some inconsistent performance in visual memory, okay? And his recall. So on this design memory task, I show you a card. It's got a bunch of geometric figures on it. You look at it, I take it away for a particular period of time, and then you have to draw what you saw. And he absolutely struggled to get that down on the page. And that maybe I can't remember what I saw, that maybe I can't get it down through my hand accurately enough. Okay. So I would want to see what his visual motor integration looks like, which it's particularly poor. So if I were going to prove as a hypothesis that it's not a problem with visual memory, it's a problem with visual motor integration, I would pick out other memory tasks that don't require him to draw to see what his visual memory looks like. Fortunately, we have the ability to do that because this kid got 900 tests, right? So let's go into, let me find his memory.
The reason why we're looking at these, Cindy, is because he has the writing is difficult for him.
That is one hypothesis, right? That's affecting his visual memory. Okay. So if we come in here in visual memory, his dot location is great. Facial recognition is a problem, but his dot location is good. So we've got this inconsistency between I can remember pictures and identify what was changed. I can remember dots and recognize what was changed, but I can't recognize faces and I can't redraw geometric figures. Okay. And I'm looking to see if, okay, so then we go into the Ray complex figure test, and his immediate recall and his delayed recall are particularly poor. So, but that's very similar to the design memory on the RAML. Okay. And then we come down into the Woodcock-Johnson. We're trying to look at subtests that would also look at that visual memory piece. And I'm not seeing anything really jump out there. So I am suspicious that there is something going on. Okay, now look, so on this design memory, I'm not sure if he got it administered twice. On this design memory, he's got a 4, but his design recognition is a 10, which suggests to me that the motoric component of how do I draw what I saw is affecting his visual memory. So I'm not.
How do I draw what I saw? So
yes.
it seems confusing for a parent to say, like, I can't remember what I saw, therefore I can't draw. Okay.
So I look at a picture, there's so much information there. I don't have a great way to organize it or label it non-verbally or verbally to begin to think about what it is and to get it down or get it back out through my hand. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I've taken in visual information, I'm holding it, now I have to recreate it. I didn't have a way to organize it, so I can't remember how to draw it. Okay.
So kids sometimes will be able to maybe say it, but they still can't write it.
Right. And on that picture memory, all he had to do was X what was changed, moved, or added. Okay. And this RAML is different than the one that we just looked at. There was a RAML 2 versus a RAML 3, and he did better on the RAML 2. So I don't think that there's a massive issue here with visual memory. Okay. Then we go into working memory and we get a really interesting contrast too. So on the verbal attention, he did okay. On the numbers reversed, he stumbled a little bit. And when we go back and we look at the whisk, his working memory on both of those is pretty impaired. So, and that would be really consistent with the diagnosis of ADHD. So if you have ADHD, one of the characteristics of ADHD is you've got deficits in working memory. So my suspicion is something's going on with that. And we see that in both IQ tests with the word order on the KABC and on the whisk working memory battery. Okay.
So you just surmised two things. ADHD, you kind of surmised based on those working memory deficits. But you also saw something that was a problem with holding things in memory and making them come out of your fingers.
Yes. Yeah. And we've talked about the fact that the verbal memory is an issue. Okay. All right. Now we're going to jump into rapid automatic naming and word retrieval. And this is a really significant issue. So at this point, I would diagnose him with a processing deficit in verbal memory and in working memory and in rapid automatic naming / word retrieval. Okay. And that rapid automatic naming is, can I go into my long-term memory, find the file that I'm looking for and pull it quickly? And I've got this hypothesis. So now what I want to do is I want to look at measures that tap into that to see whether or not we see that to be an issue. So I'm going to go into his reading and I'm going to notice that his accuracy in reading passages aloud, which is grabbing the name for that word and pulling it quickly, that's low. Also, on the test of word reading efficiency, that is particularly low. The word reading fluency on the Woodcock-Johnson is low. However, the sentence reading fluency on the Woodcock-Johnson is okay. So that actually supports the hypothesis that the rapid automatic naming is affecting his reading. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. The other place we see that pop, and I know we've got some blank numbers there, is his math fluency. So when I ask him to solve as many addition, subtraction, and multiplication facts as he can in 3 minutes, he's particularly slow. Okay. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay.
You also kind of did a little bit of an assessment where you saw a suspicion of ADHD too. So on top of the 3 processing deficits, you also smelled a little bit of ADHD?
Yeah, but that's already been diagnosed.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So next we move into phonological processing. And this is absolutely like you cannot be pounded on the head anymore. He has definitely got a processing deficit in phonological processing. Okay. He is having difficulty hearing and manipulating sounds. He has a hard time blending sounds. He has a hard time segmenting words. It is just this pervasive issue going on. Okay. The phonological processing is thereby going to affect his real and nonsense word reading, and it's going to affect his spelling. And so you can see here on the Woodcock-Johnson, we've got a spelling down on the 1st percentile, and the Wyatt, we've got spelling down in the 3rd percentile. And then his nonsense word decoding is down in the 5th percentile. You know, it's pretty clear across the board. So that we know to be a giant bottleneck. Okay. Processing speed. Processing speed is how quickly can I take in and work with information. Okay, so it's a time task. I'm finding matching letters in an array. So L, M, R, Q, M, I would draw lines through 2 M's because those were matching in that array. Okay. And then the number matching is I see an array of numbers 5, 7, 2, 5, 9. My 5s match, so I would draw lines through them. And then pair cancellation is I see a sequence of pictures, ball, dog, cup, and every time I see a particular sequence of those 3 pictures, I draw a circle around them. And so on all 3 of those, his processing speed is low. Okay.
But Cindy, can you explain why that processing speed with matching patterns impacts reading so in such a devastating way?
Because you can't see the patterns then when you read, and you're not noticing them fluidly, and so then you don't read it fluently.
So not noticing patterns.
Yeah. So when we go back and we look at his processing speed on other measures, but hang on, Kim, we get some really conflicting data. So do you see here in the processing speed on the WISC, his symbol search is actually quite robust. Okay. So, and then we go back in and we're going to look at, so if processing speed is an issue, every time I give you a timed task, you should have difficulty.
Okay.
We might have an occasional number that pops up, but if processing speed is this true bottleneck, then timed tasks should consistently be difficult for you. Okay. So when we go forward, you'll notice that his sentence reading fluency is at a 93. Okay. So the word reading fluency is low, but his sentence reading fluency is okay. His writing fluency is low and his math fluency is low. I suspect that it's not truly a processing speed issue. I think it is an issue having to do with orthographic processing and attention. That does not mean that he doesn't need extended time on tests. That means we don't look at him and say, dude, you're a slow processor. We say, when you've got a lot of things to manage, that's where we put sand in the gears. Like, we make things more difficult for him when things are under a time constraint because so many other things are happening along the way.
But if he has an orthographic processing, means remembering the picture of words. Why did he do okay on a sentence? Because there were more clues, or why?
Yes. If you misread, there's enough context that you can work around it.
That's why he did poorly on the word.
Yes, because there's not the context clues.
So the sentence gave him more clues that he used as a tool, and that's why he performed better. So you think that's interesting. So you don't think it is a processing issue?
I don't think processing speed is necessarily a processing deficit for him.
Oh,
I would want to check it in other ways. I would want to hypothesis test that in other ways. Okay. Okay. Then we move into visual motor integration. How do I take what's in my head and put it down through my hand? Okay. So consistent, really profound issue there in both drawing what he sees and tracing within paths. Okay. When we go in and we look at his written production, you begin to see these catastrophic fails. And the fact that they tried the essay task, it was attempted, and he couldn't even produce what he needed to under the time constraints. Now, let's go back in and let's look at the Excel spreadsheet, which is something that we didn't do with all the processing speed, but it's a little harder to navigate through all of that. But when we look at any of those written language measures, so his written language on the KABC was particularly low. And his written expression on the Wyatt 3 was particularly low. And it's both for all the sentence level tasks. When we get to the Wyatt 4, his written expression still continues to be particularly low. So I would say visual motor integration, really no question. Definitely, man, you've driven into more than a pothole. You're into fractured road.
So when you say visual motor integration, can you explain to them what that means?
Sure. Visual motor integration tasks are where I show you a picture or a geometric design, and I'm going to make one up so that I don't affect any of the standardized tests. So I might give you a figure that looks like this and then ask you to copy that down below. And when they do so, the test measures it in different ways. Are your angles right? Is your proportion correct? Whatever. That ability to copy what you've seen and the ability to have the motor control to duplicate what you've seen is the really significant challenge. Okay. The way that I make this come home as a construct for most parents is I give them 3 words and I ask them to write a sentence using their non-dominant hand. And at that point, the sentence gets short, they have difficulty with structure, they can't remember what they're saying, they have a hard time spelling, and that's an example of visual motor integration and how it affects your written production.
And
Okay?
when I talk to parents and they say, oh, my child is just lazy, he doesn't want to write his sentences, I said, I want you to put your pen, in your law firm or whatever you're doing at work, in your left hand. I want you to write all day with your non-dominant hand, and you tell me what your work output's going to be and how tired you are.
Yeah. which is why I tell everybody that's what keyboards are for. Okay. Okay. And then the last piece that we're going to talk about is orthographic processing. And we've got a pop here for orthographic processing as being an issue. Orthographic fluency comes up okay, but I want to go back to the Excel spreadsheet because there's some additional data there that I want to try and find, which is the test of orthographic competency, which I could have sworn I had seen before in this data. And let me try and close this up a little bit. Because I think that there is a pretty good likelihood that orthographic processing is an issue. And let me see if it jumps out at me. And if I don't find it, we'll continue to move on because we need to then talk about his performance in oral language. So I'm trying to see with her code on the side is great because it tells me what's on each page. There it is. The talk is on this page. Okay, test of orthographic competence. He's got a 70. I would say that there's a really good chance that I would want to see the individual subtests, but that there's a really good chance that orthographic processing is an issue. Okay. So Kim, list our processing deficits for us at this point. We've got verbal memory.
Verbal memory. So far, you have verbal memory, working memory, RAN, and word retrieval, rapid automatic naming. And now you're looking at orthographic processing as potentially an issue.
Visual motor integration.
Yeah, visual motor integration.
Phonological processing.
Oh, wait. So you're adding all this. Visual motor integration. Are you separating orthographic processing from visual motor integration?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so orthographic processing. And I'm sorry, what was the last one you said?
Okay, so my list is verbal memory, working memory, rapid naming / word retrieval. They're separate but not. Visual motor integration, what's in my head down through my hand. Phonological processing, how do I hear and manipulate sounds, and orthographic processing. I think we need to spend a minute explaining to people what orthographic processing is. So orthographic processing is your eye's ability to look at a word and recognize it and to key in on how little changes result in a very different word. So the classic example I give is there's the dysgraphic.
TIED.
Okay, so those two words mean very different things. I fly untied airlines all the time because I look at the word United and it does not look right to me. Now, one of the tasks that we do to look at orthographic processing is a task where I give you part of a word and I give you potential letters. So I would give you P, D, B, and Q and ask you which words go in to make a real word. Okay. Another task that we give along with that is I ask you to read a sentence and identify whether or not there is missing punctuation. So orthographic processing affects your reading and it affects your writing. And one place that it affects your reading is in your oral reading accuracy. So when we take a look at, again, the GORT pops there, on the tower that pops up, on the pseudo word decoding, that's lower than his real word reading, which makes sense to me because the pseudo word, you really have to look at every letter and you really have to think about what sounds would go with it and how to parse the word, which can be very difficult. And then his word reading fluency would then be low on the Woodcock-Johnson, and the sentence reading fluency, he would have context to help him get to the meaning if he misread things.
So when people say, oh, I have dyslexia, I switch letters around, part of it is this.
Yes.
They're not seeing, I say it in a much more layman's terms. I said, we have difficulty reading the guts inside the word.
Yes.
And attending to the guts, the inside of the word.
Yes. So that's a pretty good laundry list of things that are affecting him. Let's go back and take a minute and let's look at his oral language. Now, part of the challenge that we're going to have with this oral language, A, he's had a ton of testing, and B, he's had different levels of stimulant medication. Okay. So you'll notice here on the self, he's got a nice cluster of issues. So semantic relationships, I read you a sentence, like Bob put his sunglasses on the table and his backpack on the chair. Bob put his backpack under the chair, over the chair, behind the chair, in the chair. And you would have to tell me which of those 4 possible endings fit there. And so there's a lot of language processing that goes on there and a lot of working memory. On the following directions, I read you a prompt and it would be something like, point to the second dog after you point to the third cat. And you'd have an array of dogs and cats, right? And you'd have to figure out which ones to point to. Formulated sentences, I give you a word and a picture, and you have to generate a grammatically correct sentence about the picture using the words. And then word classes, I read you 3 or 4 words, and you have to tell me which 2 words go together. Okay. So there is something really significant in common with all of those tasks. And the thing in common is the working memory. Okay. The other thing that is common with it is, except for the word classes, they're activities at the sentence level. Okay. So I've got this hypothesis running on whether or not his understanding of oral language at the sentence level is an issue. Okay. Then we move into, so let's look at that on the told. So he had difficulty on sentence combining. So that's where I give you a couple of sentences and I ask you to combine them into a grammatically correct sentence. He also had some difficulty, not as catastrophic, with word ordering. That's a lower score. And morphological comprehension. There's a grammatical error. Can you recognize it? He also had some difficulty with multiple meanings. Well, while we're not discrepant, when we think about those scores relative to his receptive vocabulary, they're pretty low. Like, this kid's got a good vocabulary. He knows a lot of words, and we see that in multiple places. But when we're looking at some of these other tasks, it's not anywhere near where it needs to be. So I think you've got something going on with working memory as it relates to oral language, and that he doesn't know the parts of speech and he doesn't know correct syntactic structure. That would be my working hypothesis. And I would then want to see what would happen intervention-wise when we looked at those level tasks. Now, one other critical area that I want to look at here, by the way, there's a really interesting contrast between his expressive vocabulary and his picture vocabulary. So on the picture vocabulary test, I show you 4 pictures and I say a word, and you have to tell me which of the 4 pictures it is. On the expressive one-word vocabulary, I show you a picture and you have to name one thing. And so it pounds on that retrieval. Remember we talked about rapid naming and word retrieval? It pounds on both of those. So his vocabulary didn't suddenly disappear. What happened is he can't find the correct file to pull the key word that he needs on the expressive vocab task. Okay. And then when we look at the self-4, this is really interesting. I love the self-4, especially for kids with attention deficit, because it brings out this really interesting compare contrast. So he can do the multiple meanings, okay, and he can do the figure of language at an okay level. It's not fabulous, but I'm not kind of driving off the road and off the cliff, right? In contrast, he had difficulty making inferences. So in that they use, they'll give you a story like Bob's dad was a great basketball player. Bob had been picked for the select basketball team. We would say he's a chip off the old block. What does that mean? And then you have to explain what that idiomatic language means, and then you're given 4 choices that would parallel that, and you have to decide which of the 4 is like that. So he's having a hard time. Oops, sorry, I flipped those. Oh my goodness. Sorry, that's figurative language. I just blew that big time. Making inferences is you're given context and you have to interpret what's happening. So a situation like that might be Joey went over to his friend's house to play a game. They decided to play Scrabble. Joey came home. When his mom asked why, Joey said it wasn't fun. Why wasn't it a fun game for Joey? And the answer is it had to do with spelling, and he's not very good at speller, whatever, right? So that would be making inferences. You've got clues in the environment. What do those clues mean? And how do we come to an understanding based on that? So that's really hard for him. And then the conversational skills, I show you a picture, I give you a word or a couple words, and you have to imagine what somebody would have said in a scenario using those words. So both of those pragmatics scores are harder for him. So the question is it, do you not understand the non-expressed language, or is it you don't have the attention skills to do that? And I really can't answer that based just on scores. I would actually need to see him and interact with him, but that's something that should be worked on with a speech language pathologist in the context of social skills and life skills. It doesn't matter the source, but we definitely need to go in and drive in and do that. Okay. So I think that all of that kind of looking across the board, if this were my student that I was completing an evaluation on, I would be suggesting that his IQ scores are an underestimation of his true ability. I would then give that laundry list of processing deficits, so verbal memory, rapid naming, word retrieval, working memory, phonological processing, visual motor integration, and orthographic processing with a little bit of question mark there. I'd love to do a little more peel apart on that. Then I would say that there is, I would probably identify him as having an expressive language disorder. I would think about whether or not I would qualify him as a mixed receptive expressive language disorder, given some of the inconsistencies. I would say that he is dyslexic with rapid naming, phonological, and orthographic components affecting that. I would say he's got dysgraphia. And we didn't talk about math. I think that the dyslexia and the dysgraphia is likely affecting his math, and that the language skills involved in math are affecting his production. I would want to see how he performed on some visual spatial tasks, such as block design, triangles. So triangles was not particularly strong. I would want to ask questions about that visual spatial component as to whether or not I would diagnose him with dyscalculia. But there's definitely underachievement in math. So that's a pretty good laundry list, and he's a pretty complex kiddo. So that's what the data means to me, and that's how I kind of work through the data. And with that, we're going to close this one out, and then we're going to come back and say, what are we going to do intervention-wise? So we'll see you again. Good luck on part 2. I know that's a lot to digest.